You brought up the Cuban Missile Crisis and your deep fascination with that. I'd like to flesh that out a little bit here, especially pertaining to what's going on right now. We're currently seeing Russia move Russian warships to Cuba. So it seems that history is kind of rhyming here. What are a lot of the parallels you're seeing between the Cuban Missile Crisis and right now?
Okay, well, again, in fairness, I should focus. And I'm a historian. I haven't focused deeply on current
Right.
relations, um, and I don't see a complete repetition in the sense of literally, deployments of missiles and things like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, yeah.
And Cuba is doing a balancing act. It doesn't want to be pro-U.S. or in the U.S. pocket. On the other hand, ever since during Gorbachev, the Soviet Union stopped giving massive economic aid to Cuba.
Uh-huh.
Cuba has been forced to distance itself in terms of its economy and has had much more hard currency and economic relations with Latin America, with Western Europe, with Canada, with Mexico. In other words, it doesn't feel like it can be as beholden to the Soviets as Castro. And I actually spoke to Castro personally about this at a conference. Um,
No way.
uh, oh yeah. Um, they felt he was asked, what were the chances that you would swing to backing China in the Sino-Soviet split, because Mao and the Chinese favored armed revolution around the world, and so did Fidel Castro, whereas Khrushchev and the Soviets favored so-called peaceful coexistence. I'm putting that in air quotes, not sure you can see,
Yeah.
since 1956. In other words, saying that the danger of nuclear war, thermonuclear war with the West is so great that communism should triumph gradually through more peaceful methods or for wars of national liberation. And Castro didn't like that, but as he confirmed to us, because I was at a lunch with him with various people, and he attended a conference that I attended where he was the most active participant for hours and hours on end. He basically said we had no choice. That since the American embargo had closed oil refining and all sorts of other economic sources, we had to subsist on Soviet bloc and Soviet aid to buy sugar, especially that the American sugar annual quota of purchases had been discontinued actually in the summer of 1960 by Dwight Eisenhower. And so that they felt no choice but to become a Soviet ally. But that choice was as much economic as it was in terms of ideological congruence or sympathy. But I'm not sure the danger of repetition is that great because obviously the impact of sanctions on Russia has not been as great as many in the West thought it might be at the beginning of their invasion of Ukraine, but they are still not in a condition to provide massive economic aid around the world like the Soviets did to communist parties and to communist states like Cuba, Nicaragua, and Angola, and Vietnam, and which was harshly criticized during the Soviet collapse, and they ended up discontinuing that when the Soviet Union and the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, were under very intense pressure. But my focus has more been on the history of the missile crisis because that has exploded from the old days. I still
Yeah.
remember it used to be in the 1970s, 1980s, into the beginning of the 1990s. Everyone just read the same book, Graham Allison's Essence of Decision, which was written by a political scientist based mostly on background interviews with Kennedy administration officials and incredibly superficial when it came to communist decision-making. And it did not even have access to the declassified American record, except what had been made public, and had a lot of mistakes. It was only in the 1990s, one of the most exciting parts of my job in the 1990s was commissioning and gathering through various means documents from Soviet foreign ministry and Soviet Communist Party archives about Soviet-Cuban relations and about the missile crisis, getting them translated into English or getting them from places like Japanese NHK television that had bought many of them in the Wild East competition for documentaries that they want to show, and through an advisor. I was able to get their translated Soviet documents and then publish them in the Cold War Project Bulletin. And we learned amazing things that not only historians but policymakers had no idea about at the time of the missile crisis. And I'd be glad to talk about that with you, which you might or might not want to get more deeply into, because some of them have really changed the history that Americans grew up with for a generation.
No, please do expand. How has these revelations changed our understanding of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, there are, again, myriad different ways, but let me just mention the most important. I still remember in the 70s and the 80s, Americans knew all about the Cuban Missile Crisis from the American side. And I still remember reading or seeing the documentary Missiles of October, where Martin Sheen and someone else played the Kennedy brothers, and they reenacted XCOM meetings. You know about the XCOM, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council that was created. And, there were multiple books, and they all had lots of interesting gossip and information about American decision-making and very little about Soviet decision-making other than what was public or what had been smuggled out after Nikita Khrushchev was ousted in 1964, and then his memoirs began appearing in the West in 1970 with Khrushchev Remembers, and then 4 years later there was a second volume called Khrushchev Remembers the Last Testament. Now, everything began to change during Gorbachev's glasnost. There began to be more candid discussion of the events by former Soviet officials, including one of Khrushchev's speechwriters named Berlatsky, Khrushchev's son, Sergei Khrushchev, Anastas Mikoyan, who had been Khrushchev's number two, his son, Sergei Mikoyan. So you began to have more candid evidence in terms of oral history.
For those who don't know, what was Gorbachev's glasnost?
Gorbachev somehow became the first secretary, the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which was the de facto leader of the Soviet Union, in March 1985, after 3 Soviet leaders died in 3 years. They were all geriatric. First, in November 1982, you saw the death of Leonid Brezhnev after 18 years in power. Then you had the KGB chief, Yuri Andropov, take over. He died in February 1984. Then you had an apparatchik, or sort of party official who is not considered very impressive, named Konstantin Chernenko. He died after just a year and a month in power. And Gorbachev, who was in his late 50s, he was the new generation. He had been on the Politburo. He had been sort of a protege of Andropov to some extent. He became the leader in March 1985. And it did not take long, because he had actually visited Canada. He had visited the United Kingdom. He had a feeling that the West was pulling further and further ahead of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union needed to reform. And he was one of the millions of Soviets who viewed the Brezhnev period especially as the zastoy, or the period of stagnation, where the economy had lagged and also where there had been massive corruption. And no one really believed in communism, but people were opportunists. They had to become members of the party to get jobs and things like that. Stalin and Khrushchev, there had been no reform possible, although Khrushchev had attempted reform in the mid-1950s. There had been the thaw after Stalin's death, but he had to constrict that in the early 1960s before he was thrown out in 1964. When Gorbachev came to power, he was determined to embark on reform, both economic reforms to try to make the system more competitive with the West, and political reforms to try to make the system more honest, so corrupt officials could be expelled from power either through more honest elections or through more honest party procedures, and in foreign policy, because he wanted to have better relations with the West, especially Western Europe, the United States, Japan to increase commerce, increase trade, and increase access to Western technology, because he began to realize that in computers, possibly in military gear, the Soviet Union was falling further and further behind. So he embarked on a reform project, and there were two best-known parts of it. One was a word known as perestroika, which was the Russian word for restructuring. And that was to actually an attempt to try to introduce elements of capitalism, or at least market economics, into the system so it could try to function more effectively and more efficiently and produce more. And that was done very gradually because it ran up against all sorts of vested interests that didn't want to be challenged. But also, Gorbachev started to increase candor about previously too sensitive topics, and that was known as glasnost, which came from a Russian word for voice, and that became increasingly a way for Russians to speak more candidly about corruption, but also, and this is something that Gorbachev underestimated, for residents of places like the Baltics, the Caucasus, Ukraine, Central Asia, to speak more candidly about their nationalism. I mean, for example, they had been forced to become republics of the Soviet Union. They had been forced to ditch their national flags and have new flags that were designed in Moscow. In many cases, their leaders were Russians who had been chosen in Moscow by the Communist Party. They really wanted to move away from that. And under glasnost, they could express those criticisms more frankly. And even more so, one thing that Gorbachev never expected is that the criticism became so strong, especially because there were things to complain about. Not only the war in Afghanistan, which was continuing to send home Russians in body bags and dragging on in a deadlock, but of course in April 1986 you had Chernobyl. And that was a disaster that was covered up. It was only revealed when the radiation penetrated into places like Sweden and Poland, and they could see it, how much it had gotten out. There were officials who tried to cover it up and even distribute food that was infected, things like that. And, this dramatically expanded criticism, especially in Ukraine, but also in Russia. And so there were more and more complaints. But what really culminated things is the criticism began to reach even Soviet foreign policy decisions like the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the invasion of Hungary in 1956, but also even back to Lenin. And Lenin was like the George Washington of the Soviet state. He was the founding father. And when you begin to challenge Lenin, you're completely challenging the legitimacy of the Soviet state from another direction, from those who were challenging it from the nationalistic perspective, because they wanted to break up the Soviet Union because they felt they should not be part of it. And so, this is really approaching an existential crisis. It really becoming an existential crisis for Gorbachev. But glasnost, what matters to Cold War historians is history and sources. Glasnost was fantastic for history because it led to much more open discussion of historical controversies, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Soviet invasion of Hungary, to the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, to the Soviet involvement in the Korean War, to Stalin's crimes in the purges, where he killed millions of Soviets, and to many other topics, and investigations of the Communist Party, criticism of the Communist Party. Now, it only very slowly led to the opening of Communist Party archives. I remember there was a big hullabaloo in 1990 when literally the first document was released from a Soviet archive intentionally, and it was actually a report from the Soviet ambassador Novikov in Washington in September 1946, and it was almost the Soviet analog to George F. Kennan's long telegram from Moscow. earlier in 1946, in February, about the origins of the Cold War. But to finally get back to your question, one thing that was also published in 1990 was an unexpected third posthumous volume of Khrushchev's memoirs, and it was called Khrushchev Remembers the Glasnost Tapes. And these were transcribed tapes of Khrushchev when he had already been ousted and was at his dacha, dictating his memoirs into a tape recorder, and the cassettes were smuggled out by his son and others. But these were snippets of his memoirs that the family considered too sensitive to publish in 1974, but they were willing to publish in 1990. And it included a fantastic chapter about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And one thing that it revealed was that at the height of the crisis, Castro was expecting an American invasion on October 27th, or imminently thereafter, Saturday, October 27th, 1962, the most dangerous day in human history, and secretly wrote Khrushchev to urge him that if the Americans invaded Cuba, he should launch a preemptive nuclear attack on the United States. Because to Castro, an American invasion of Cuba would be the beginning of World War III, and the Soviets needed to get in the first nuclear strike on the United States. Now, we learned that when Khrushchev got this letter, he was horrified because he thought if they lost Cuba to an American invasion, that would be a shame, but he was not willing to commit suicide over.
It's not worth, world destruction.
Right, well, it was sort of like, it would have been like the American reaction to the Soviet invasion of Hungary 4 years earlier, which is, okay, let's make this a propaganda victory because this is so terrible, but we're not going to send American forces to save Hungary because that would be a direct conflict with the Soviet Union. I mean, it's very reminiscent of Ukraine situation in some ways.
Right.
But that was denied by Fidel Castro, and so Castro published a long article in Grama, which was the official, and still is the official publication of the Cuban Communist Party. And that, in turn, led the Soviet government under Gorbachev to say, no, wait a minute. Here is the original correspondence. They released for the first time the original correspondence. And it confirmed that Castro had urged, albeit using a couple of euphemisms, a preemptive thermonuclear attack on the United States if the U.S. invaded Cuba. But the key thing is it greatly stimulated additional evidence. The other that's one of the two main most important things we've learned in terms of how that might have contributed to the end of the crisis, because the history that had emerged just from U.S. sources is that on Saturday night, Bobby Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's younger brother, who was the Attorney General, had secretly met with Anatoly F. Dobrynin, who was the Soviet ambassador in Washington, and told him that Kennedy would orally, secretly agree that if the Soviets removed their missiles from Cuba, that within 5 months the Americans would remove their Jupiter medium-range nuclear missiles from Turkey, but would not agree so publicly and would not agree in writing. And many accounts had been written presuming that that was what allowed Khrushchev to agree to remove the missiles from Cuba, which is what he publicly announced on Sunday, October 28th. However, what we learned gradually after the revelation of Castro's letter to Khrushchev is that Khrushchev had gotten so upset about this letter and so worried about the missile crisis spiraling out of control, because also that same day, October 27th, an American U-2 plane had been shot down over Cuba and the pilot had been killed, but Khrushchev had not authorized this. This was done without authorization. Fortunately, Kennedy did not order a retaliatory strike because he was afraid that it might escalate the crisis, but that helped influence Khrushchev, together with this letter from Castro, to say, this crisis is getting out of control, we need to end it, we need to liquidate the crisis. Also, fortunately, we've learned that Khrushchev rejected a proposal to respond to the American blockade around Cuba that Kennedy ordered with a Soviet blockade around West Berlin. And a couple of important officials, including the deputy foreign minister and the Soviet ambassador in Washington, urged this. But Khrushchev decided, no, one crisis is enough. We don't need to start that one. And that was very lucky because Kennedy expected him to do that. And that would have made the missile crisis much more dangerous. Now, the second most important thing that we've learned that has really changed some of the history and the debate took place actually the first week after the Soviet Union went out of existence and was replaced by Russia. That happened in the last week of December 1991, and coincidentally, there was a conference in Havana on the Cuban Missile Crisis of U.S. former scholars, people like Robert McNamara, who are still alive, McGeorge Bundy, who is still alive, Arthur Schlesinger, American scholars and international scholars, also Cuban officials, including Fidel Castro, who's there for the whole conference, and also former Soviet officials, both civilian and military. And so that conference took place the first week of January 1992. And it was at that conference that the head of the Soviet forces in Cuba, who is still alive, a guy by the name of Leonid Pliev, revealed that in addition to the Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles and intermediate-range ballistic missiles that could reach almost the entire continental United States, which is what the crisis was about from the American perspective, Khrushchev had also sent battlefield tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba that could have been used against an American invasion force. And the U.S. had virtually no idea. They did detect some launchers that were dual use for either nuclear or non-nuclear rockets, but they had no sense that as it gradually leaked out or streamed out, that Khrushchev had sent as many as 100 different forms of tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba that could have been used against an American invasion. It could have destroyed Guantanamo Base. There was nuclear artillery that was aimed at Guantanamo that was all ready to be used the moment a war got started. And when the American former officials, like McNamara and Bundy, McNamara had been Kennedy's defense secretary, Bundy had been the national security advisor, Dean Rusk was in bad health, so he didn't attend. When they learned about this, they were completely horrified because the most important thing that John F. Kennedy said when he announced the crisis on Monday evening, October 22nd, 1962, was that the United States shall regard any missile fired from Cuba against any target in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union upon the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response against the Soviet Union. And this was ironic because when John F. Kennedy had campaigned for president against Richard Nixon in 1960, Kennedy, like the other Democrats, had criticized the Eisenhower policy of massive retaliation. The idea of if the Soviets do anything bad, we could retaliate disproportionately. Instead, Kennedy supported the idea of flexible response, the idea of proportionate retaliation and and an ability to be involved in limited wars, even limited regional wars that might turn nuclear, to up the rungs of the escalation ladder in order to avoid all-out nuclear war. But when the missile crisis happened, Kennedy flipped right back to massive retaliation because he was threatening the Soviets. You do anything with those nuclear weapons, and we are going to completely destroy you. And when the Kennedy officials found out that there had been a danger that the local Soviet commanders could have used locally based and armed nuclear weapons against the American, they were horrified because they thought if thousands of Americans had been killed by any use of a nuclear weapon, Kennedy would have been overwhelmingly pressured and overwhelmingly compelled to attack the Soviet Union. And by the way, this has been enhanced later. We've learned that the Soviet submarines, the B-59 submarines that were inside the blockade line, the so-called quarantine of Cuba, each had a nuclear torpedo. And we've also learned, only in the last 10 to 20 years, that on, again, the most dangerous day in human history, October 27th, 1962, on at least one of those submarines, there was an argument between the top two officials, the captain and the head political officer, over whether or not World War III had started, because they were so deep underwater that their communications with Moscow was broken, and the U.S. anti-submarine warfare forces, the ASW warfares, were trying to force the Soviet submarines to surface to keep track of them. And because they had no way of communicating with them by radio, they were trying to politely knock on their hulls by dropping depth charges. And in several cases on the submarine, they didn't interpret this as a polite knock on the door. They thought the Americans were trying to sink them. And so in at least one case, one commander was urging, saying, World War III has obviously started. Let's use our nuclear torpedo to sink an American fleet or flotilla or aircraft carrier before we're sunk. And the other commander fortunately argued, well, we can't do that without authorization. We have to get high enough to communicate. And it turned out they were so near Florida that when they approached the surface, they were able to hear Florida radio, and it was normal broadcasting, music and other normal. There was no sign of World War III on the Florida radio stations. And this helped convince the commanders of the submarine, well, maybe we shouldn't launch our nuclear weapon yet. But had they launched a nuclear torpedo, sunk American ships with thousands of sailors, again, the pressure on Kennedy to launch a nuclear retaliation against the Soviets would have been irresistible. Yeah. So, history, but there is an ongoing debate about how dangerous the missile crisis really was, because it affects current and future policies about which is safer for the future of the world, nuclear deterrence or nuclear abolition. And, for example, Barack Obama, was one of those who hoped, and if you look at his speech from Prague in 2010, hoped for eventual nuclear abolition. But there are others who say, no, that would just make the world safer for conventional war, and that could be just as destructive and eventually lead back to nuclear war anyway. Where there are others who say, well, if the alternative is nuclear deterrence, sooner or later our luck will run out. Yeah. And that'll lead to destruction.
All it takes is one nihilistic madman.
Neither option is especially appealing at this moment.
Yeah, neither of them are appealing. I would think that nuclear abolition would probably be the better route. I would rather live in a world without the threat of nuclear war.
Yep. On the other hand, people who lived through World War II in a lot of ways weren't too happy about it. But the key problem is the transition period. Could you have a transition in which neither side feels so endangered? And this was part of the problem with Reagan, something we haven't talked about at all. When Ronald Reagan launched his Star Wars project, the Strategic Defense Initiative, on March 23rd, 1983, and tried to convince Gorbachev, for example, at Reykjavik in October 1986, saying, what's wrong with defense? That's perfectly moral. And Gorbachev's response was, no, if you're going to build Star Wars, we're not going to respond symmetrically and improve our defenses. We're going to overwhelm you by increasing our offenses. And when Reagan said, oh, we can share our defenses, Gorbachev says, you don't even share your dairy milking technology. There's no way you'll give us, your technology. He didn't believe it. And so Star Wars was blocking, the conclusion of what would have been a breakthrough agreement at Reykjavik in 1986. But the whole question of, defenses, it goes back to the arguments. This is one reason my undergraduate thesis got so long, to the debates at the United Nations in 1946. And, the Baruch Plan was tilted in favor of the Americans, and also the American plans for nuclear arms control all the way for the next 20 years always required inspection and verification on Soviet soil, and Soviet leaders never agreed to that until Gorbachev for 40 years. In 1986, from 1946 to 1986, no Soviet leader. That's why you didn't have a comprehensive test ban under Kennedy and Khrushchev, because Khrushchev would not agree to on-site inspections of suspicious seismic activity and things like that. That's what allowed Gorbachev to become such an arms control leader, was he completely flipped Soviet policy on inspections to permit it. And that's what allowed him to sign the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement with Reagan in Washington in December 1987, which was the first treaty that led to the elimination of a whole class of nuclear weapons. Of course, Trump, just backed out of it, like almost everything else. But the Gorbachev story is incredible. And by the way, that same guy, William Taubman, who wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Khrushchev, also wrote a comparably wonderful biography of Gorbachev. And Vlad Zubak, as I told you, the best Russian to emerge from the old Soviet system, wrote a book a few years ago called Collapse, which is a fantastic book about the Gorbachev years and the final collapse of the Soviet Union. So you've got a lot to read.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane how close we were to nuclear war. I mean, thank God.
But it can be debated, to be fair. Each case, you needs as much evidence as possible so you can really I asked that question on to all my students every year. How dangerous was the X crisis and Berlin crisis, Cuban Missile Crisis, whatever, where their obligation is they need to look at some of the original sources and make an argument. And there's no correct answer. The key thing is, do they use evidence and make plausible arguments?